During this current crisis, we have been working around the clock to increase our podcast and blog production to the highest possible level, knowing that every little bit counts. However, we're still limited in this effort due to budget constraints. All of our work relies on the power of donation. So if you find this content of value, please consider supporting our mission so that we can continue our efforts.
And welcome back. I'm joined today from Australia by Nathan Ruser. He's a satellite imagery analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, focusing on human rights. And we're going to be talking about the complicated and ever-changing realities on the ground in this ongoing conflict. But before we do that, Nathan, thank you very much for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself and your work for our audience?
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I guess I've worked on sort of conflict tracking and human rights tracking, especially using satellite imagery for a while now. I've looked at Syria and I've looked at Xinjiang, and in previous a bit of Myanmar as well. But now considering sort of the situation in Myanmar, the human rights emergency there, and the sort of ever-changing, I guess, military realities on the ground, I've been focusing a lot more of my time on Myanmar.
And it's actually really interesting because you've got experience with different types of conflicts, whether these are international conflicts, looking at the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, but also the more subtle internal types of problems, the things, for example, that we're seeing in Xinjiang in China. And I know that you previously mentioned Syria. So looking at the Myanmar conflict, how would you compare tracking the Myanmar conflict and analyzing the Myanmar conflict to the other types of conflicts that you've looked at?
Yeah, I think it was, I forget who exactly said it. It may have even been Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan, but he said internal conflict is ecology in the way that these actors sort of interact, compete, and everything. And I think Myanmar is really a proving ground for that strategy. There's the massive conflict ecology of how all these different ethnic resistance organizations, all the older, more established EAOs and the new PDFs have sort of come together, and it makes it a very difficult conflict to really track because so much changes at the local level over miles, over villages, over even times of day. The sort of limits of different actors' control is hugely different. And so Myanmar is, in many ways, especially since the coup up until quite recently, it's been almost impossible to map in sort of a 2D representation of drawing colors and points and polygons on a map, because it's been such a localized dynamic that changes. Recently, there's been more sort of established control, and I think that's a huge testament to how much gains the resistance has made in recent months. But yeah, throughout the period of this conflict, it's been very difficult to track. And I'd say rather than sort of Syria and Xinjiang and Russia and Ukraine, I think in many ways, the closest analog in terms of control on the ground would almost be Afghanistan for the decades that there was a strong Taliban insurgency and also quite stubborn Afghan security presence, where sort of it was very similarly impossible to map with I guess the control being equally sort of changing day by day, hour by hour, and no firm front lines. And I think that's what marks a lot of this conflict in Myanmar.
Because that's kind of the, how should I put this? A lot of people, when they look at conflict, they have this image in their heads. I think many of us have grown up, watching documentaries and studying history. When we look at conflicts like World War One and like World War Two, we're so used to seeing colored maps. And World War One famously with these trench warfare, you had front lines that did not move for weeks or months at a time, or they would move and then they would immediately move back. World War II was very similar in a lot of ways. The Falklands War, people who are in the UK, people were tracking the war on like little maps at home. It was possible to do that. And now with Ukraine, we've got a lot of live updating maps of Ukraine that seem to be able to do the same thing. We've got a clear front line. Yes, it does change. Territory changes hands, but why is Myanmar so difficult to pin down and say, well, this is resistance territory and this is Tatmadaw territory?
Well, I think when it came to Ukraine, one of the things when the conflict first happened, when Russia first invaded, one of the sticking points I made sure I followed in my maps was that the furthest the Russian military reached didn't necessarily mean they controlled everything behind it. I think for 2 or 3 weeks when I was mapping Russia and Ukraine, instead of using these colors on a map, I was using arrows to sort of show the troop movement. And what we saw there was Russia sort of sending troops as fast as they could towards Kiev and sort of not really focusing on securing the areas behind them. And I think that sort of shows it shows how much the conflict in Ukraine has changed from that to almost World War One style trench warfare. But I think sort of understanding the tone of the conflict is one of the most important parts of mapping it. And so in the Myanmar context specifically, I think it's intensely difficult because for most of the post-coup era, generally the military was sort of holed up in its barracks in the sort of towns that it had under firm control, but was able to send sort of marauding parties out into the countryside, and the resistance sort of had to just evaporate away from that. We're seeing that change a bit, but for a lot of the lowland Myanmar, that's still the case, where sort of territory is hard to define if you look at it in what does this group control and what can this group prevent their enemies from entering. Because in many cases, you can have PDF fighters walking within 200 meters of a main township police station, but you can also have junta troops from that same police station sending convoys out scores of kilometers into the countryside and sort of assaulting villages. So that dynamic is very hard to map. Sort of, I guess, internally, and of course, this isn't sort of a one-size-fits-all structure for Myanmar, but I sort of view things in sort of a scale of 1 to 5 resistance control, where sort of you can sort of see this dynamic of competing and conflicting control in a much more, I guess, nuanced and complex way than just colors on a map. But also that makes it very difficult to map, especially at sort of the local village level that's required.
Because I've had similar discussions with people who've asked me, oh, is it true that this amount of territory is under our control, or that amount of territory of this city or this village? And I always have to explain, as you are, that I mean there is a difference between having a troop presence and a difference between having government administration and a difference between not actively being afraid that the military could show up tomorrow, open fire with mortars or artillery or machine guns, and then just leave. Like, these are different levels, and it sort of reminds me a little bit of the Vietnam War, where the very concept of control and the metrics by which progress had to be evaluated were regularly being updated because the old thinking was not working. Is there any actual agreed upon metric that can be utilized to determine who is in control? Because people love throwing these numbers out there. They love saying, oh, the PDF is in control of this percentage of the country, the military is in control of that percentage of the country. Is there any way to actually measure that objectively?
Not really. And I
Okay.
think Vietnam is a very sort of another very apt comparison point, wherein you had massively different sort of local and temporal dynamics of control. Um, I would say, and this is probably a bit of a deep cut, but there's a Greek scholar called I forget his first name, but someone Calivas, and he wrote a book called The Logic of Violence in Civil War. And there's a chapter on that that sort of looks at the different definitions and the different levels of control of groups in civil conflict. And I think that is a very useful starting point to sort of start conceptualizing what control looks like in Myanmar, because it's far from this single binary. And
Mm.
but I think, yeah, like you mentioned, there's the big difference of sort of where PDF fighters are able to walk around with a gun versus where civilians can feel safe. Like even in Kampat, which is a town that was pretty thoroughly captured by the resistance recently, and I think very crucially, the resistance was able to defend it from a very um, comprehensive attempt to retake the town from the Sit-Tap, from the Tatmadaw,
Mm.
where I think there was 3 different columns of hundreds of troops that all did a sort of coordinated assault on the town, and the PDFs were able to defend the town, and I think that's actually one of the first um, occasions where the non-ethnic resistance organizations have been able to capture and control territory against a really consolidated counteroffensive. But even then, we saw days ago sort of airstrikes killing dozens of civilians in the town, and with sort of that threat from the air, there's a big difference in sort of how you can, I guess, start to conceptualize this control.
But you're coming from a very interesting perspective because you are, as you say, a satellite imaging analyst, and that's a very different view than the view purely from the ground. And we've spoken to analysts who are getting their information from fighters and people who are actually looking at the battlefield horizontally, not vertically. So it's very interesting to see. How do you find that looking at satellite imagery, you have a better or perhaps a worse insight into what we might term the soft factors? So not just necessarily things like territory being controlled, bombing runs, or barrages, but things like morale and the level of food that is available, the level of sanitation and hygiene that is available, and the general sort of psychological state of people on different sides of the conflict. How do you relate to that dimension?
I would say it's certainly worse in those soft areas. I think the satellite perspective and the on the ground perspective necessarily sort of go hand in hand. One can tell you things that the other can't tell you, and vice versa.
Hmm.
I think so. So when it comes to all of those soft power stuff, and even when it comes to sort of the changing realities of the dynamics of control that I've been talking about, I think reports from on the ground are by far the king when it comes to learning about a situation in that context. I think where the satellite imagery is uniquely helpful is providing a more comprehensive look at the situation. So the way that I sort of like to consider it is that when you're getting reports from on the ground, in most cases, those are data points. You sort of
Hmm.
learn what's happening in this village at that time, but using the satellite imagery, you can sort of scroll through huge areas, sort of examine huge areas, and get this comprehensive sort of idea of what the picture looks like throughout. I don't know if that makes too much sense, so I'll throw in a bit of an example. But sort of when you're trying to track, let's just say the Kachin front line between the KIO and the junta forces, when you're relying on reporting and even on the ground sources, it's very hit and miss. You'll hear about this particular hilltop which is controlled by one side or the other. But again, also there's a whole different issue of trying to locate exactly where that hilltop is. But with the satellite imagery, where that's been really useful for me has been to sort of go through the front line, mark out every sort of hilltop outpost, mark out every securitized area, and then sort of being able to systematically go through them and say, this one is Kachin controlled, this one is junta controlled. and you can
Mm.
sort of start to pick those different satellite signatures up because of the different doctrines and the different trainings of the different armies. So, for example, quite easily looking from satellite imagery, you can tell a KIA outpost from a junta outpost, even if they're within like a hilltop of each other. And so that sort of allows you to get this I guess more comprehensive map of the front lines, especially in the more established conflict zones throughout the country. But yeah, when it comes to sort of the nuances of control of sort of which authority is the one in charge of the curriculum in this school, there's satellite imagery is almost useless in that front, and that way
Mm.
you certainly need the on the ground reporting and the on the ground sources.
I'm curious though, like that, how does that work? Because presumably from a satellite, you're not identifying things like colors on a flag or the uniform being worn. Especially from top down, that would be very difficult. So how are you able to look at something like an encampment, which one presumes that a military encampment's a military encampment, they all kind of work the same way because there's one most efficient way to set up your thing. How can you identify the differences between them?
Yeah, you'd be surprised sometimes how stark the difference is. The SIPTAP generally their outposts are pretty uniform. They have these purely cleared areas with 3 or 4 different lines of razor wire or fencing around it, pretty cleared within the outposts. Like it's basically a few tents and maybe a couple of trees, but it's not like forested.
Mhm.
And a particular sort of shape and configuration of those frontline trenches. When you look at a Kachin outpost, it's often quite different. With it's often quite forested. I guess the doctrine and the training of how they've constructed those defensive lines are quite different. And sort of once you've looked at, I think if I go to my internal map here, I've got about 750 different ethnic resistance organization outposts mapped. Once you've sort of started to look at that number and your mind is in the right sort of mindset, you can sort of key into the differences pretty easily. Another thing that's also crucial to tell is sort of how to access those outposts. So, sort of, if you can see 2 outposts that look almost identical within 100 meters of each other, but one of them clearly has access from the west, one clearly has access to the east, you can sort of start to trace those roads back to positions that you know one side or the other controls. And that's
Mm.
how you can sort of start to assign that. And additionally, there's a few giveaways with a lot of junta positions. A lot of them have helicopter pads. A lot of them have sort of much more comprehensive artillery sort of positions that ethnic resistance organizations just don't have. Um, where it really becomes tricky is when it comes to the pro junta militias that have sort of been, I guess, recruited, and because a lot of them are splits and originally were part of the ethnic resistance organizations, that's when it sort of starts to become a bit tricky because they've
Mm.
followed their old training and their old doctrine, and their posts can look a lot like for example, some of the Shiny Nationalities Army outposts look a lot like a Kachin Independence Army outpost. And sort of that's when you have to go back to, well, who is reported to control this area? And sort of start to bring in those additional on the ground sides of stuff.
Okay, that's interesting. I was just almost thinking it'd be almost nice of them to sort of spray paint some logos on the ground so you could see it from satellite imagery more clearly. But
I wish
yeah,
everyone thought in a way of how to make the satellite analysts happy. But in many cases, that's what the helicopter outposts are. You see a helicopter outpost, and almost universally, that's a hunter position.
okay. Well, I mean, okay, that makes sense. And so air bases and things like that, we can always presume are going to be junta controlled.
Yeah, but also because of the I guess the complexities of the logistics behind a lot of these more remote positions, which a lot of the frontline ones tend to be. Often it's just easier to supply it, even historically before the coup, but especially now, it's often easier to supply it via helicopter, or at least have access to helicopters.
Mm.
So even if there's like scores of outposts that would almost never have a helicopter there, they still like to have that helicopter landing zone. And that's something that obviously the ethnic armed organizations that don't have helicopters and have no need for a helicopter, they don't bother with that.
Mm. And so, is there anything that satellite imagery can tell us with regards to urban fighting an urban control, because you wouldn't have conventional bases, presumably, that are visible from the sky. Like one would presume that you're more likely to have something like a converted police station as your operating or your base of operations. Can you see sort of lines of control in urban settings?
You certainly can't get to that sort of scale of that level of detail you can in the more militarized areas, in urban areas. What you can often tell is especially since the coup, junta positions and police stations and even places like the General Administration Division offices throughout the country have often fortified their borders. They've sort of dug those trenches, and you can see those.
Okay.
And you can additionally see the checkpoints pretty easily with the sort of quality of satellite imagery we have now. You can see sort of the roadblocks and the checkpoints and everything. So in that case, you can sort of get a pretty good idea of where the encampments are. But
Okay.
then that's where then there's the difference of sort of, I can tell you that the junta is in this position, but I can't tell you how far they wander from that position on a patrol. And that's when it sort of
Right.
comes to the on the ground reporting. So, for example, in Taze, where there was a big resistance push to take the town, you could map out pretty comprehensively all the junta outposts in the city, and then you sort of relied on media reporting, sort of what the PDF statements were saying, to know exactly sort of beyond those positions and even sort of when those positions were taken, where exactly the freedom of movement for junta forces in an urban area was.
Okay. And so if you can see the roadblocks, does that mean that looking at the highway system, looking at the road system in general, can you see which roads are and are not operable?
Not always, because a lot of the things that sort of would, firstly, unless you're willing to spend a lot of money, which unfortunately not many people are willing to sink into Myanmar, at least from a satellite perspective.
Mm.
The imagery isn't necessarily super recent. So you're sort of relying on month-old or even sort of sometimes year-old imagery. So it's hard to sort of track the day-to-day developments from that sense. And
Okay.
also a lot of stuff like damage from some large mines that won't really show up. What you can sort of see is the checkpoints, and again, it's hard often to tell, is this a Pusorti run checkpoint or is this a PDF run checkpoint? But you can sort of establish that they're there. I guess how I like to frame it is the satellite imagery in many cases shows you a base. It shows you sort of the baseline to compare to, and
Hmm.
then once you sort of start getting information from the incredible reporting and journalism on the ground and on the ground sort of sources, you can sort of fill in a lot of that baseline and sort of see what's changed and what hasn't, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it is very much a syncretic approach. Like you need both types of input to really get a clear picture.
Absolutely, yeah. My map would be my understanding would be useless without sort of on the ground info as well, and reporting and what statements are saying and all of that. Um, the satellite imagery in some areas can be useful to map the front line. In other areas, it can be useful to sort of locate the positions that various places are talking about. But it really needs to be done in conjunction with sort of pretty detailed on the ground tracking.
Okay. That's good to know. So then, so having sort of clarified what the information is, what form it takes, what are you actually seeing? Like you're getting a very nice bird's eye picture of this ongoing conflict. What is the direction of the conflict as you see it?
I think we're sort of starting to see a pretty clear trajectory away from consolidated or even majority junta control for most of the countryside into them needing to. It's hard to sort of frame it really easily, but you're sort of starting to see more and more heavily defended positions, which indicate that sort of this is in the lowland area, that sort of indicate there's less freedom of movement on the ground for junta forces. They can't sort of send out the marauding crews that they used to through the countryside, and you're seeing that as well with the fewer villages being burnt. That's not to say no villages are still being burnt, but it's definitely fewer than we were seeing sort of in 2022, early 2023.
Mhm.
And I guess you're just seeing this general shift towards, in many ways, before it was. So it's a bit hard to articulate, but I think for a long time since the coup, when the resistance really sort of started in earnest, you had a lot of the countryside being controlled by the resistance by default, but them
Mm.
having to just move aside and sort of let the junta forces through. You're seeing that sort of change in most parts of the country to a situation where the junta forces instead are the ones that are sort of hauled up in their fortified positions and not able to leave them. And so I think that's generally the trend that we're seeing. And then also in the sort of more traditionally sort of ethnically restive areas and a lot of the borderlands, you're seeing a straight movement towards areas being completely cleared of junta forces, sort of even these fortified outposts being captured by the resistance and affiliated organizations, and just a very quick almost consolidation of junta control to the purely the urban areas and purely sort of these shrinking zones of control.
So it definitely does sound like we're moving at the very least in the right direction, with regards to pushing the military back and limiting the military's ability to do these sorties that they would regularly previously run. I remember last year we were hearing just story after story after story of the military just driving past the village, opening machine gun fire as they went, or just shelling villages for the sake of shelling villages, or going in and abducting people and then later having the bodies found. So it sounds like the military is simply less mobile and therefore less able to carry out these types of I mean, they're terrorist attacks. Fundamentally, they have no strategic purpose, so they're essentially terrorist attacks. So it seems like we're going in the right direction with this. Do you
Yeah,
foresee any problems with this? Like, do you think it's going to come to like a brick wall at some point?
it's it's hard to sort of assess that because a lot of the sort of more stronger consolidated areas of junta control aren't as fortified as the traditional. So, sort of, if you look at North Shan State, there's a military base on every hilltop, essentially. Whereas, sort of, once you start to get to the urban, once you start to get to the lowland floodplains, there's none of those natural defensive lines. It's not as heavily fortified. So I don't think there's going to be sort of coming up against a brick wall. But
Yeah.
I think you're sort of seeing that. Um, I don't think you're going to be seeing resistance forces marching through major cities in the imminent future. Because I think there is sort of definitely the ability of junta forces to consolidate around these key positions, these key cities, and these key transport lines. In Syria, we saw it's not an official policy, but it was very widely called the useful Syria strategy, where the Assad regime sort of pulled back from a lot of the outer parts of the country and just focused on not letting there be huge areas of opposition control in what it called the sort of useful Syria, Damascus, Homs, Hama, Aleppo corridor.
Hmm.
And I think for almost the last 8 or 9 months, even before the launch of Operation 1027, which has changed things massively, I think you sort of started seeing that trend happen pretty clearly where the roads and the transport and the logistics that the junta was using to supply these sort of more remote areas was getting less and less tenable, and
Mm.
you sort of started seeing these sort of more peripheral outposts falling, and I think that's a trend that's going to just accelerate. And when you look at places like Rakhine State, Chin State, Shan State, Kachin State, Karen, I think that's definitely the trajectory of pretty rapid, um, in areas, I think the possibility of pretty rapid junta collapse.
Okay. And so, do, do you think the military's position might? And I know this calls for conjecture, but do you think the military's position might just be, you know what, screw the ethnic minority regions, whatever. We're not good at defending mountains. We're not good at defending forests, and we need to consolidate around the Bamar regions. Just sort of the military abandoning those more forested, more mountainous, more ethnic minority dominated regions, and trying to just fall back to the Burma heartland and hoping that they can maybe fracture the country but control at least the Burma majority.
To an extent, I definitely don't think it will be a decision they make or that they choose to make it. I think it'll be a thing that they're forced to make. If you look at North Shan State, for example, I think already within the last few months we've gone from them controlling practically every urban major area, all the township centres and all the towns throughout northern Shan State, to controlling less than 20% of them. And there's now basically been this very obvious pullback of forces to Lashio and to sort of Pinulwin and those sorts of areas. So I think it's not going to be a decision where they go, you know what, we don't need Shan State, we don't need most of Kachin. I think it's going to be a area where they're eroding control of especially transport lines, they're eroding control of supply, they're eroding control of sort of ability to keep these really remote places stocked with soldiers against a sort of more concerted resistant siege of them. I think that's going to force sort of the pullback from a lot of those areas. And you're sort of, again, it's going to be hard to, it's right now it's hard to see whether it's going to be a trend or just a single data point, but the KIA shooting down that helicopter recently, without helicopters, most of these frontline outposts inherently cannot be sustained because there's no control of the roads anymore. And so if the I guess the helicopters and the aerial resupply becomes more vulnerable, then that's going to sort of speed up that decision. But I think very much I've heard a lot of conjecture, and I'm not sure if I wholly disagree with it, that the Tatmadaw has famously and historically been good at defending hilltops, has been good at defending these fortified regions, and once the resistance reaches these areas with fewer, I guess, natural defensive lines, it'll sort of push through quicker. I'm not necessarily discounting that, but I think when you look at the sort of, I think currently the junta is strong enough that it can sort of create those defenses around the areas that it considers the most, I guess, the most strategic and the most crucial for its survival. Of course, I should mention that I don't think that is a thing in the long term. I think we're seeing the most definite erosion of junta power, and I think within not long at all it'll be a very different conversation. But I think we're not about to see sort of resistance forces marching onto Mandalay or Naypyidaw or Yangon in the same way that we saw them marching into Laokai in Shan State.
So you did mention the helicopters and the sort of waning military power. Now, the three things I refer to them as the three A's of artillery, armor, and air power. These three things seem to be the real sort of trump of the military, because this is something that the resistance forces have historically not been able to match, and more importantly, something that they have not been able to counter. And most important among those has been the air power, because it's so rapidly redeployable. Are we seeing a decline in the military's air power? Because that seems to be the big thing that's stopping the revolution from really pushing.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, and I'd say that the armor and the artillery won't save them. It's only the air power that's saving a lot of these positions. I can't necessarily give any good predictions on sort of how the trajectory of that.
Okay.
At the moment, I'm not seeing massive struggle to resupply a lot of these outposts. I'm not seeing sort of, I don't know. It's tricky because you are seeing reports of sort of frontline outposts under attack calling for air support and not getting any and then surrendering. But I think it is not at the critical sort of inflection point of making the air power useless yet. I think it still has. I think the air power itself is sustaining a lot of these positions and right now I don't see signs of them it declining rapidly enough, like imminent collapse of of that air power supply. But yeah, they're definitely the issue is the Tatmadaw is sort of traditionally fought on one front at a time. It's fought in one place, sort of ceasefire, then fought in another place, and it
Mm,
can focus its whole air power, its whole infantry in this one position, and that's sort of been a winning strategy for the Tatmadaw throughout history. The resistance or the traditional ethnic armed organizations have never really been able to counter that effectively, especially when pragmatically it's better for the groups that aren't under current attack to stop fighting. And now the difference is the fact that this resistance is countrywide. You've got to fight in Shan State, you've got to fight in Kachin, Sagaing, Chin, Rakhine, everywhere. And there's only the same amount of airframes. And in fact, there probably are issues that I'm not fully around on, sort of maintenance and resupply of these of their airframes. So I guess the issue is there's certainly less to get to your question a bit more directly. I think there's certainly less um, air power than is required throughout the country, and that's one of the reasons that we're seeing large areas fall.
mm,
But I don't think the air power is about to collapse in the same way. In the same way that the 3As you mentioned, I think armor right now is basically useless to the junta
mm.
because they don't control the roads, because they don't. I think there's almost no area, and we saw, I think it was last year when they tried to send an armored convoy through Chin State. I think it might have been from Hakka to Mindat,
Mhm.
and that was ineffective. So I think right now the armor in that 3A has become useless. But
Okay.
I don't think the airframes have, or maybe not useless, but definitely not saving their position. But I think the aircraft still is relevant.
This is one of the things, like even the armor component, I was getting word from resistance groups in the east, in Karenni state, basically saying that, well, as far as they can ascertain, there are about two tanks. The military claims it's 10, but there are about two, maybe four tanks in the entire state that just keep getting moved around from location to location. But they're so heavy and unwieldy, particularly in a mountainous region, that resistance forces can always just be somewhere else. They're not they're not really a rapid response tool. They're just something that eventually will come along and try to scare you away from a protracted engagement. But by then it's too late. So the armor has, what I've been hearing for quite some time concurs with your conclusion that the armor is of limited value when mobility is a sticking point, um, which in a lot of these areas it is. And one of the other analysts we spoke to, who was analyzing the interplay between environment and conflict, was basically saying that there's a sort of not even a gentleman's agreement, just a natural outcome whereby a lot of the ethnic minority resistance groups want to fight in territory that is heavily mountainous or heavily forested. The Damodar wants to fight in regions that are low lying and open plains, and so the actual brunt of the fighting takes place in regions that are hilly and moderately forested, because that's where both sides agree that they're willing to attempt an engagement. And in those cases, armor and artillery are just very difficult to mobilize. So it makes sense, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
that matches with sort of my thoughts as well.
yeah, I mean, there's the thing, like, terrain doesn't change. Mountains are still mountains, forests are still forests. It doesn't matter what year we're in. A heavy piece of metal moving from point A to point B has to contend with the realities of the terrain. So it's not surprising that this is still a sticking point. Um, but that being said, let's move a little bit more global, not global, but a little bit more broad, because you referenced Operation 1027, and you referenced it as a success. Now, 1027 is named for the date, the 27th of October, when the Three Brotherhood Alliance officially sort of began this offensive. It has now been 2.5 months, a little bit more than 2.5 months since 1027 officially launched. How would you appraise 1027 and its role within the broader resistance movement?
I think it's going to be hard to sort of say conclusively if this is the start of the end for the Tatmadaw or whether this has just sort of been a change in pace. And I think a lot of that relies on how content a lot of the Three Brotherhood alliance is in just recapturing their territory, or whether they're committed to sort of eradicating the junta from the battlefield outside of areas that they intimately care about. And I think we'll see that relatively soon with the MNDAA, how they have now recaptured their homeland, as they would frame it, and whether they then just sit in Kokang and are happy with that, or whether they sort of redeploy their soldiers to the moving front lines and continue pushing. But I think more broadly, it's hard to overestimate how much of a change this has been to the battlefield. On my map, which and again, my map is sort of opportunistically tracking as much as I can. I can't comprehensively map everything, but I have 625 different outposts and positions and places that have been captured since the start of Operation 1027. And those numbers are sort of a huge move up, a huge shift in gear from what we were seeing before. And we're seeing stuff like I think in Sweni recently, we saw the fall of the first Division HQ, which had never happened before. In Laokai, we saw the Regional Operations Command HQ completely fall. And we've seen, let me just check my statistics here, but I think right now we have it up to about 38 different towns and urban areas that are under resistance control, and about another 20 that are actively contested. Whereas before the 1027, that was basically zero. And we're seeing, even outside of the areas where these Three Brotherhood alliance are most active, I think we're still seeing quite a dramatic shift. I think what stands out to me is Korlin in Sagaing State. That's a district center. That's like the seat of a district that is completely under resistance control, and that is almost like I don't think I would have projected that would have happened a few months before the launch of this operation. Likewise, we're seeing Loikor, the state capital of Karenni State, basically being about 60, 70, 80% resistance control. And that's something that I don't think we would have been able to foresee before the launch of this offensive. And I think it's just beyond the I guess the development on the battlefield. I think it also has a massive impact on the military itself and sort of the decision makers in Naypyidaw. I think it's massively changed the tone of it would have necessarily have massively changed the tone in the conversation there, from sort of being the Tatmadaw will win to
Yeah.
what are we facing now? And of course, this isn't based on any knowledge in Naypyidaw and what the generals are thinking, but I can't see how that sort of steadfastness that the junta would come out ahead. I don't see how that, considering sort of the massive defeats in Kokang and in other areas, how that can be sustained.
Okay. So it definitely, it sounds like you're saying that not only has 1027 been a resounding success, but also that momentum there has not slowed. Like this, we are likely to continue seeing successes of 1027 and the sort of the dominoes that have fallen as a result of that, moving forward over the coming weeks and months.
Again, I think that is a matter of, I don't think that's fully set in stone yet, because like I said, the MNDAA could just happily sit in Laokai. The TNLA could take what they consider they want and then leave it there, or they could keep pushing into Mandalay. They could start trying to take Mogok. They could start pushing towards Pinulwin. And I think that is the decisive thing on the momentum of this, and whether it sort of continues steamrolling at the rate that it has since 1027 launch. And even sort of at the start of this year, I wouldn't have imagined Kutkai, I wouldn't have imagined all the division headquarters in Sweni would have fallen so quickly. So I think the momentum definitely still is on the side of the, and I know there was a bit of I guess, conjecture for a while that because the Brotherhood basically launched a surprise attack, they were able to take 200, 300 outposts all at once, and that rate had slowed. And I think that rate definitely had slowed, but I think we're sort of still seeing that the culmination of that momentum shift happening. I don't think it's there was the surprise attack and since then it slowed, I guess.
Okay. Which again is still very favorable information for us, something that's very good to know. So now let's actually turn to the slightly more global perspective. Um, you're working in Australia. You're working for the Strategic Policy Institute, and I know that you're very keen to draw the distinction between your personal comments versus what the institute may or may not believe. But before we delve into that, let's just clarify what actually does the ASPI do?
So we are basically an independent think tank that I guess it essentially sort of it basically fills the role of a normal think tank in that we have questions we want to answer and we find the answer to them. For me, that's mostly been using satellite imagery and human rights. But for other sections of the organization, that's been about defense acquisition, that's been about cybersecurity and all of that. But I think at its core, we just sort of try and provide decision makers with the best available information. And I know that's a very generic response for what a think tank does, but I think that sort of fits us relatively well.
Mm. And so, just to get a little bit more clarification on that, like you're an independent entity. You're not part of the government. So how like what happens to the information? You have questions. You answer the questions. You have data. You have reasonable predictions. Who winds up reading those?
I think generally the target audience is decision makers, policy makers, and just sort of allowing people that make the decisions in various capitals, especially Australia, to have the most relevant information. So it's this thing of we have a question, we want to answer it, we try and find someone that will fund us to answer that question, and we provide that information in sort of a digestible, clear way. But I again that process, in a way, sort of I think um, on the issue of Myanmar particularly, that sort of is where it starts being a bit difficult because regrettably, there's not as much care about Myanmar in a lot of these Western regional capitals as I think there probably should be.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that because there seems to be it's not just Australia. Like as you say, it's a lot of Western capitals. The Americans have definitely done some things over the last couple of years. We just saw them sanctioning MOGE recently, the Burma Bill, the NDAA, and so on. The European Union has also made some movements with regards to Myanmar, but it is quite limited from the perspective of the people who are on the ground fighting, or even from the perspective of the civilians who are on the ground dealing with the consequences of conflict. These um, these sanctions and what money is notionally being made available to the general Myanmar cause doesn't seem to be translating into a whole hell of a lot on the ground. So why do you think it is that Western states are not particularly keen, even though as soon as something happens in Israel, everyone's focused on it. As soon as Russia does anything, everyone's focused on it. Myanmar's closer to home for Australia than either of those two, but there's very little focus.
I think Myanmar is also a perfect opportunity for Australia to sort of fulfill its desired role as a middle power in the region, in how it can sort of start to resolve these emergencies and these crises. But yeah, I think you're right in that there is a lot of inaction. And I think, again, I've got to stress that this is my cynical perspective of it and not necessarily anything else. But I think it comes down to a few different trends. I think it comes down to the idea that supporting the unknown is risky, especially when the resistance sort of started moving from that unarmed protesters being shot at in the street to fighting back. I think there was this sense of, well, we don't know these people. There's no leader that we can attach ourselves to and feel confident that sort of nothing bad is going to happen if we support these people. And I think that's been a major sort of pushing point against real concrete action being taken. This idea of better the devil we know.
Mm.
and especially when Myanmar has traditionally been seen as a very restive, very fragmented place, I think there's a probably overblown concern that even if the junta were to be ousted, then it would just be another round of infighting between various well-entrenched armed groups across the country. And I think that's one barrier for, I guess, any real practical support for the against the junta. I think another issue is that generally, I think in the last 10 years or so, in my mind, since the Libya intervention, there has been a massive change in tone from Western governments against sort of intervening and tipping the scales in these humanitarian emergencies. I think we saw pretty much how poor the Western response to the use of chemical weapons in Syria was. We've seen similar stuff throughout much of the world. I think where I guess between 1990 and 2012, basically, there was this shift towards R2P. There was this shift towards responsibility to protect, and this shift towards if a government won't protect its civilians, we will step in to ensure that they do. And you even saw that on the streets in Yangon and throughout Myanmar at the start of immediately after the coup. Once they sort of started to get systematically shot at, people were holding signs saying R2P. But I think in the West, a lot of the conversation has moved away from that. But you also mentioned Ukraine and Israel, and I think that's sort of where it takes it to the third issue that I think is sort of inhibiting a helpful response. And I think it's just this idea of statism that I mentioned Kalivas's book earlier in this interview, and I think he actually had a very insightful thing I read a while ago that said under sort of in this international in this statist perspective, there's the idea of only states have the right to start a war, and therefore only states are, inherently have protections from abuses in war. And I think I'm probably butchering that quote, but I think it comes down to this idea of the Western focus is on states. It sort of moved from this idea of non-state actors and protecting non-state actor rights in conflict to this very statist ideal of the groups that we need to move to protect our states. We need to defend human rights within this state framework. And I think that's been problematic as the nature of conflict has sort of shifted away from state-on-state conflict, with the exception of Ukraine, of course. But I think those are the sort of three trends that I see as the biggest barrier to a useful response.
Because I think you raised a couple of points there, but let's just look at R2P for a second. You're right. Very early on in the conflict, or not even the conflict, I mean, it was pre-revolution, post-coup pre-revolution. We saw people on the streets in Yangon, as you say, with these R2P signs. We saw a lot of internet content focusing on R2P as well. And so when that started happening, this entire coup for me personally has been an absolute crash course in everything from economics to battlefield strategy to international politics to history to everything. And so I actually reached out to friends that I knew who had actually worked at the United Nations in very minor capacities, but nevertheless, I asked them to explain R2P to me, and they sent me the actual documentation of R2P, as sparse as it was. And I read it, and I was shocked. I was reading this like, this says nothing. This is a two paragraphs of just words that add up to effectively nothing. And my friend was telling me, he's like, yes. And it took years of lobbying to get even those words past the United Nations, because no country wants to be hoist on their own petard. No country wants to be passing these lofty, declarations and treaties and agreements and all these sorts of things, only to later be subjected to them when they themselves engage in questionable conduct and third-party nations decide, well, we have the authorization to take action here. So R2P, at least from what I saw, was phenomenally weak And looking even at the United Nations Security Council, the possibility of bringing in peacekeepers, which because of the permanent seats of Russia and China was never going to happen. But even if it were to, again, talking to my friends in the United Nations, they're like, well, don't forget that if you send in a peacekeeping force, number one, anything that happens to those soldiers is bad for you politically. Number two, anything those soldiers do while they're there is bad for you politically. Number three, you have to foot the bill for your own soldiers. So a lot of countries just won't do it because they can't afford to send peacekeepers into foreign countries. So it's the entire international framework seems to be so fraught with a lack of willingness to take a moral stance, a lack of willingness to invest political capital and money, and a lot of vagueness over what is and what is not actually permissible conduct for a country. With the Myanmar context specifically, one thing that has been pointed out to me has been ASEAN, and that there are certain countries who do want to take a more proactive stance on Myanmar, but they're hesitant to step on ASEAN's toes. Um, so do you feel that there's a situation where countries maybe do see the importance, the moral argument is clear to them, the geostrategic argument is clear to them, but it's this awkward social dance of who is supposed to take the lead, who is supposed to be calling the shots in this, and everyone looking around waiting to see whether anyone else is going to take the first step.
But I think when I was sort of talking before, I sort of talked about 2011 and 2012 as the inflection point, and I think that brings back to a lot of what you were hearing, in that it took decades and decades of lobbying to get this relatively weak R2P framework sort of accepted. And then we had in 2011 the Libyan intervention, which I'm not going to comment on whether the Libyan intervention was good or bad, but the fact that it was sort of framed within this R2P framework and then sort of used by NATO warplanes to strike at military targets that weren't necessarily in the middle of massacring civilians.
Hmm.
I think that left a horrible taste in especially Russia and China's mouth. They sort of considered that occasion of them being duped by the R2P framework, them being duped by this years of lobbying going, what's the worst that can happen? And then sort of seeing it used in their mind by NATO for a political point to overthrow a dictator that they didn't like. And I think that sort of basically shattered the idea of R2P as an international consensus framework. And we saw that in Syria so quickly afterwards, where no one stepped in to do anything against the chemical weapons usage. And I think also in that period, there was also the Haiti UN peacekeeping force, which I think in a lot of cases did quite a lot of. I don't know the history of the Haiti intervention as well, but I know it definitely didn't leave a good taste in a lot of people's mouths. So I think those two things combined are sort of what turned the page on this R2P policy and sort of made it from this something that especially Russia and China, but also a lot of the global South, and even you sort of mentioned no country wants to put these mechanisms in place and then be subject to them. You can see that in the US not being part of the ICC.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that sort of turned it from these decades of lobbying to get something slightly productive into sort of it being dead in the water.
It's just that whether there's a situation where countries might actually want to act, but because of the inherent vagueness of the international community and the standards and norms and the documentation that exists, no one's really sure whether or not they have the authority. If for example, Australia were to put boots on the ground in Myanmar, which is never going to happen, but hypothetically, if they did, does Canberra feel confident that the international community would not condemn that? Or is it just going to be this massive question mark of like, okay, we can try to go in and try to do some good, but we might be hailed as heroes of the international community, or we might be condemned as neo-colonial invaders, and we're encroaching on ASEAN, and we're encroaching on China's sphere of influence, and so on and so on and so forth.
I guess to an extent, I think, yeah, I think it's tricky. I think when it suits their interests, a lot of countries in the world have no issue stepping over those sorts of regional blocks. So if it was something of interest to them, I don't think that's necessarily a barrier, but I think there is definitely an idea of well, this is something that ASEAN's working on. We shouldn't touch it. And I think there's also this idea of sort of not wanting to support things that they don't know entirely.
Yeah.
And so I think that those sort of come together of it would take us a lot of diplomatic, political, and military capital to move the needle in this case. And here are the excuses to why we don't do it, and so
Yeah.
we don't do it. So I think that is definitely. And there was also one more thing I wanted to add to the last rambling off-topic thing.
Yeah.
But you mentioned how there are some acts that sort of the international community sees as more important, and I
Yes.
think for me, I think even though there was so much inaction in Syria, I think chemical weapons is still something that is majorly is sort of something that's hugely frowned upon by the rest of the world. And so even though I can understand when you see soldiers getting injured or civilians getting injured by chemical weapons or claimed chemical weapons in Myanmar, is nothing compared to the human rights abuses of bombing schools and killing hundreds of civilians. I think one thing that I keep trying to make clear to anyone that will listen is that for actors on the ground in Myanmar, if you have allegations of someone using chemical weapons, get proof. Get blood samples,
Yeah.
get clothes samples, take photos of the munitions, take photos of the symptoms. And I think that is one avenue where sort of that could potentially move the needle, not to intervention, but that could make the international community feel like it has to respond in some way, which at the moment they're sort of ignoring. So that's
Yeah.
just one thing that I would say, that if anyone has any contact or a way to get that message to people on the ground, that's what I always say. If there's chemical use accusations, which there is quite often in Myanmar, get documentation, because there's been no sort of adequately documented occurrences so far.
I mean, the obvious inherent issue with that is the difficulty of getting documentation in a lot of those circumstances where you don't have electricity and internet, much less a functioning laboratory where you could do, a spectroscopy, for example, and determine what a sample actually contains. Um, but yes, I think that's generally actually been a huge issue with the Myanmar conflict. The rapportage has been very uh, spotty because you've got huge swathes of the country which have no internet, which have no electricity. Um, you know, I've worked with advocacy groups, and I've tried to bring information to light, and the concept of provenance. Where does a piece of media come from? When was this taken? Where was this taken? Who took this? What is being depicted here is so difficult to ascertain because there's no infrastructure in place. People are just happy to be able to get the footage out of some of these regions at all. And conducting autopsies and conducting chemical testing is just so difficult to accomplish. And I think this has been possibly one of the greatest successes of the military, is being able to quash a lot of valuable information from being able to make it to the international community, and therefore protecting themselves from the condemnation that they probably do deserve. Even if some of the claims are false, and I'm sure some of the claims are false, many of the claims are true, and they should be tried in The Hague for what they've done. But
Yeah, that's
it,
an interesting perspective, because I think from my view, coming from looking at Xinjiang and looking at Syria, where there is intense contestation about every single thing that's happening, I've actually been surprised at how much there is not there's not sort of a mainstream counter narrative. Sort of when you sort of see, I forget where exactly it was, but when that school got bombed in last April and killed lots of
mm,
people, there wasn't the massive conversation about, well, did it really happen or who really did it, that we see in Xinjiang and Syria. So it's really interesting to hear your perspective on stuff not being documented well enough, which I do agree that there's a lot of stuff that is being poorly documented and sort of isn't making it to the UN.
mm,
But from my perspective, I actually have been surprised at how uncontested a lot of the claims are, and I think that also comes down to the fact that in by and large the resistance isn't making claims that are being found to be untrue.
Yes.
But yeah, it just compared to Syria or Xinjiang or even the Israel-Palestine conflict, how I guess, yeah, my perspective, my experience is different in that. Not to discount what you've seen, which I agree with. But yeah, it's just interesting the different perspectives there in sort of the baselines of
Mm.
contestation. But I think there is definitely the idea that because especially the UN gets a lot of its information through the mechanisms it's established, which are inherently from states and quite statist, I think a lot does get missed and doesn't sort of make it to
Mm.
Europe when perhaps it should.
And I think one of the fundamental differences, if you're looking at Xinjiang, China, um, how do I put this gently? China has a very large, let's call it national PR department. Um, they are very, very much concerned with how they are represented internationally. They are like the Chinese are incredibly fast to respond to any statement by any government that is critical of China, whether China's international activities or China's domestic activities. Russia seems to want to defy and want to show itself to be very strong and very powerful and flex when it can, but at the same time Russia is also very conscious that it has to try and portray its actions as justified. Um there's an old joke of three people have been taken hostage by your stereotypical cannibals in the jungle, and like a German and a French and a Russian, and so everyone gets a last wish. And the French and the German, they use their last wishes, and ultimately they're killed by the tribe. And the Russian's last wish is for the tribal chieftain to punch him in the face, which he does. And then the Russian pulls out a machine gun and murders half the tribe. And the chieftain asks him, "Well, why didn't you do that to start with?" And he says, "No, no, no. Russia is never the aggressor." And and it really captures the essence of that Russian PR. It's like, no, no, no. Everything we do has to be to defend Russian minorities. It has to be to defend Russian ancestral territory. This artificial narrative we've seen of Novorossiya as part of Eastern Ukraine as being an ancient part of Russia. It has to fit into that narrative. So Russia and China both are very conscious of their PR on the world stage, whereas the Myanmar military in particular have followed an isolationist policy for so long that I don't think they care all that much. Like they're defending against the ICJ case brought by the Gambia, but that's about as far as they're going, and they're not really pushing that all that hard as far as I can tell. So I just don't think they care. They're not contesting the details because they don't really realize that international opinion matters. Number one. Number two, so far the international response to murdering civilians on camera has been a strongly worded letter.
Yeah, I was going to say that why should they care about it when it hasn't hurt them at all really yet in the international community? Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think one thing that stands out to me is like the only way in which the military gets its message out to the world is the global new light of Myanmar and how
Yeah.
absolutely laughably poor that's been in some cases. I remember seeing an article like in the middle of Operation 1027 saying how good Chinese cross-border trade is and then using photos from a captured border post to
Yeah.
demonstrate that. Yeah, so I think, yeah, you're right, but it hasn't been a huge priority, and I guess why should it be a huge priority when it hasn't really affected? What I do find interesting on that point is that to some extent China, but also especially Russia, hasn't sort of who is a major supplier and a major supporter of the Burmese military, hasn't really, I guess, launched its capabilities in that PR department to sort of try and hold water for the junta, and
Mm.
that's probably because Ukraine's taking up a lot of all of their attention right now. But compared to the ecosystems of disinformation we saw around Syria that were almost solely coming from Russian sources rather than from Syrian domestic sources, I think it's interesting that we haven't seen that for Myanmar, and I think if I was in the halls of power at Napier during the coup right now, I would be very nervous because in many ways Russian intervention is what ensured that the Syrian government could stay in control and in
Mhm.
many cases, in most cases, freeze the conflict and push it in its favor. Um, and I think it's an interesting sign that Russia, despite its material support for the junta and its vocal support, isn't really going to go to too much effort, at least not the effort that it did in Syria to save the junta when it's falling.
I mean, Russia Russia is at the point where they have to buy spare ammunition from North Korea,
Yeah,
much of which doesn't work. Like the situation that the Russians are facing is so dire. I don't think Myanmar is on their radar at all anymore. And I mean, who can blame them? Um, I wonder though, because I get the impression that as much as the Burmese military has this long-standing relationship with Russia, and even after the revolution happened, we saw Min Aung Hlaing flew to Russia to receive some artificially created, I think it was an honorary doctorate or something from the military academy. So that relationship is definitely there, but you know, Russia Russia is Russia. Like they'll help you, but that help has to be compensated. You got to pay. They're not going to give you an attack helicopter just because they really like you. Um, you still got to pay the 35 to 36 million dollars that thing costs. And I think the attitude within Myanmar military might be that they're hoping that China is going to sort of step up to replace the Russian support, and whether that's material support, whether that's strategic support, financial, or whether it's PR. So this sort of segues us to the more pressing, thing. You talk about Australia aspiring to be a middle power in the region. Well, China is not a middle power, and Myanmar is on the Chinese doorstep. So is there an extent to which proximity to China is causing a lot of hesitation among Western powers from acting on Myanmar?
I'm not sure if I'm honest.
Okay.
I think there's arguments on both sides. Um, but I also think and it's definitely been something that the large parts of the resistance has sort of been advertising, that Myanmar is a perfect opportunity to counter China in the region. The NUG is a perfect opportunity to sort of get rid of what they could argue was a Chinese client state, which I think is a bit simplified, but replace it with a democracy focused government and sort of and sort of this massive opportunity. And again, I think, yeah, I don't know how much that has sort of moved the needle in capitals one way or the other. Because I think there is that argument. There's also the argument of we don't want to confront China in this area where it has built so much of the core of its sort of economic um, tendrils through the region. Um, so yeah, I'm actually not sure there. I think there's arguments on both sides, and I guess when the needle isn't moving at all, it's hard to say why the needle isn't moving.
Okay.
Um, but I think Chinese policy is hugely interesting when it comes to Myanmar, and um, I think China in this regard is hugely pragmatic. I don't think it has any amount of loyalty to the junta. I think it has loyalty to its own interests in the region, and you've sort of seen the NUG playing that up in a way, sort of saying that they'll support a one China policy quite recently, and I think reasonably they have no option but to do that.
Yeah.
But I think Operation 1027, there's been a lot of conjecture on just how involved China was in greenlighting that.
Mm.
But I think they're definitely. I think the scale of fighting on China's border, I guess, it's hard because the Chinese policy definitely doesn't determine what the Three Brotherhood Alliance or even the United Wa State Army does. But I think there definitely had to have been some level of acceptance within Beijing
I
that
mean,
or at
I
least
have to push back a little bit on that because some of the information I'm being told is that um, what the United Wa State Army does is 100% dictated by China to the extent that some of the leadership of the United Wa State Army has now been detained and is awaiting trial in China, and were replaced at the behest of Chinese authorities. Um, so, I mean, I don't know where your information comes from, and my information's coming from filtered through multiple sources. But at least what I'm being told is that China has a significantly larger role to play in guiding the direction of some of these organizations, particularly the UWSA.
yeah, that is one question I definitely had quite recently. Like even in the last week when
Mm.
the UWSA sort of moved on, I think it was Hopang and Panlong. Would they have done that without an okay from China to do that? Um, and yeah, I think to some extent what China wants isn't a junta, but it wants stability, and I think
Mm.
it's pretty willing to blow to join in with whatever way the wind is blowing. And I think
Yeah.
there definitely has been an acceptance of, well, we're going to deal with the MNDAA and the United Wa State Army on our border rather than the junta. And I don't know if that's a policy that they actively pursued, but they're definitely accepting of it.
I mean, I think the way that you've characterized China is, I think, a very very accurate and very important characterization of China. Like when it comes to Taiwan, when it comes to Hong Kong, China is very ideological. But when it comes to pretty much anything else, China is first and foremost pragmatic. It's very much like we will play whatever game we need to play. We will partner with whoever we need to partner with. We have strategic objectives, and we're willing to meet you halfway to achieve those objectives. So when it comes to Myanmar, I wonder whether you've been following this and how much you think it played a role in it. We recently interviewed Jason Tower of the U.S. Institute for Peace with regards to these scam centers that have held tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in slave-like conditions, many of whom are Chinese citizens, with the tacit approval of the Tamado, thousands of whom have now been released by the Three Brotherhood Alliance. So I don't know whether you've necessarily been following that, but I wonder, do you think that would have played a role in the Chinese government subtly shifting towards the Three Brotherhood Alliance?
Prior to Operation 1027 being launched, what was it, the week earlier that there were, I think it was 30 Chinese civilians killed by the Kokang BGF?
Mm.
I think that is definitely something that I think that definitely played a role
Yeah.
in sort of the operation being launched when it did.
And there was some mortars very recently hit the Chinese side of the border. They hit a
Yep,
Chinese village.
yep, and it seemed like they couldn't have hit it accidentally. um,
I don't
but
know how you accidentally fire a mortar the wrong side of a border, but yeah,
yeah,
sure.
yeah, but yeah, I think we're sort of seeing. I think Chinese policy towards Myanmar has shifted a bit, and I am no stranger to how uniquely horrible Beijing can be in circumstances. I've
Mm.
spent years researching Xinjiang. I've spent lots of time following Hong Kong. I know how horrible it can be in places, but I think the like you said, the guiding force in Myanmar is pragmatism, and I think it's important to, I guess, for actors to recognize that even though even when China is doing things that are absolutely not supportable,
Mm.
um, its strategy in Myanmar is a different is being guided by many different principles than what's guiding those crackdowns elsewhere.
I like
In
you.
that
One thing
they
I enjoy, like as I was looking through your Twitter feed, and if you'd like us to, we'll link it at the bottom of this interview so people can look at your coverage as well. But your Twitter bio has 寻衅滋水, um, picking quarrels and provoking trouble, which I'm glad to see you're doing your best to live up to. And for those of the listeners who don't know what this is, it's a piece of legislation in China that is so broad in its definition and application that it can effectively be used by any police in any circumstance to arrest someone who may potentially, if you squinted at them, possibly be doing something that the party does not approve of. It's just a very convenient way of getting rid of quote unquote troublemakers. So I don't know. It sort of tickled me when I saw that in your Twitter bio, and it's um, good to see you living up to it in
I think,
interview.
yeah, ASPI especially has not made any friends in China because we've spent years mapping out the scale and extent of human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and we've very much
Mm,
based their PR machinery against that. But I think it is important to not get hysterical when it comes to China policy, and to sort of have this sober look at sort of what Chinese goals are, even if it is a recognition of goals of colonialism and
mm,
arguably genocide in Xinjiang. In Myanmar, the goals and the guiding principles different. And I think it's an
yeah.
important nuance to sort of understand when it comes to looking at Myanmar in its regional context.
And on those goals specifically, my interest was piqued because I was doing a pre-interview with someone a few days ago, and he's published an article that will hopefully reference an interview. And one of the points that comes up is the Strait of Malacca. Now, again, for those who may not be familiar with it, because it comes up a lot, the Strait of Malacca is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's on the south of continental Malaysia, and it's a very important strait for sea transportation, basically connecting the Indian Ocean and everything west of the Malay archipelago to the South China Sea and ultimately the Pacific Ocean and everything east of the Malay archipelago. And it's a quite a narrow strait, and it's there's always been this fear that Western powers could, in the event of conflict with China, block that strait and therefore hamstring China's ability to import resources and to export products. Myanmar is located to the west, and the theory has been put forth that Chinese interests may involve having access to Yangon Harbor, historically one of the biggest harbors outside of North America, which is located to the west of the Strait of Malacca, thereby being able to protect themselves from the possibility of Western powers trying to cut off that chokehold. Would you agree with that analysis?
I think that's definitely been a guiding sort of aspect of, especially the One Belt One Road initiative, the
Hmm.
BRI. I think Chinese policies sort of in a few nuanced ways evolved past the BRI now, but at its core, yeah, it absolutely is interested in being able to get resources and get economic value, avoiding the Strait of Malacca. And Myanmar has been a huge aspect in that. So has sort of some overland ports, and I think sort of even Bangladesh is quite important in that aspect.
Hmm.
But yeah, but I think when it comes to the pragmatism, China doesn't care if it's Tatmadaw troops
Mm,
guarding that pipeline towards Rakhine State. They just care that it's not being attacked.
okay, so stability is actually the objective of the Chinese here, you would say.
I think so. I think in that, yeah. I mean, I'm not an economic expert in any sense,
Hmm.
but I would say that yeah, they view Myanmar geographically as important, but not necessarily one government or one junta or not.
Hmm.
A lot of the BRI work was done with the NLD to establish these pipelines and these ports and this access. Um, and yeah, I don't think they're necessarily glued to the junta in a way that I think a lot of people in the West still assume.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Belt and Road initiative has very centrally gone through Myanmar, and a lot of
Yeah.
their overseas infrastructure investment is absolutely centered in the country.
And so this is something that has always confused me, for example, because you mentioned that the NLD government was playing along with the BRI, and I was living in Yangon from end of 2016 onwards, and I saw with my own eyes the sheer volume of Chinese, especially construction. Right, a lot of Chinese construction sites were popping up around Yangon. So it seemed to be that there was a good relationship between the democratic or pseudo democratic government and Chinese economic interests. Whereas when you look at the military, um, yes, the military can change and it can evolve, but it was under the military dictatorship that ethnic Chinese were being effectively hunted down. I was being told stories from friends in Yangon of back in the 60s, the roof tiles of Chinese homes being ripped up and boiling water being thrown through. The embassy was attacked and had to be temporarily shut down. Like this, the Chinese are pragmatic, absolutely, and they can move past things like that. But they're not foolish, and they should remember that it's the exact same military. It's the same club that led that charge against the ethnic Chinese in Myanmar who are taking power now. So it always felt to me as though if China wanted to truly be pragmatic, it would want to back the democratic forces that have already shown themselves to be open to Chinese economic interests and expansion, and not the military forces who have shown themselves to be indifferent to the Chinese, slave labor in Myanmar and have been responsible for small level ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, and there's also the legacy of the Communist Party of Burma and its Chinese support, and I think that probably guided a lot of those sort of ethnic hostility that you were
Mm,
hearing about. Um, yeah, I mean, I think in Beijing's side there are positives and negatives to a more democratic government. In Myanmar, there's definitely, I think, in no small extent, they just see that the military is horrible at economic management, and
yeah.
they're acutely aware that if you want economic development in Myanmar, the military has been by far the biggest hindrance of that in the
Mm,
country's history, compared to sort of, I think in the pre-interview you mentioned how you could see year on year development and growth during the slight NLD opening up. So I think that's like one of the positives also, that historic sort of, I guess, targeting that. I don't think China sort of is hung up on that, but they definitely don't forget it.
yeah.
Um, but then I also think that historically and generally globally, China gets on better with more authoritarian governments, and a push away from authoritarianism is a push away from how much China can easily tip the scales in Myanmar. So I think there's positives and negatives on both sides.
Okay. Which makes sense. But then, okay, so moving away from China, then let's focus then on Australia, because ultimately at ASPI, you're hoping that your work, your research, the information that you provide is going to make its way into the hands of the people who make decisions, with regards to Australia's position in Myanmar and the region generally. So, what are you noticing at the moment? Does Australia have any aspirations towards Myanmar? Does Australia have any policy towards Myanmar? Is it a just wait and see approach, or is it just not even on the discussion table?
I don't think it's being hugely discussed where it matters. I think Australia is distracted with a lot of other things: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, the issue in the Red Sea, China, more generally in the Asia Pacific. I think that's taking up a lot of policymakers' time, and I think it's sort
Mm,
of a, this isn't a core interest to us. We'll just wait and see approach. I think there is definitely opportunity to be proactive and support sort of how the direction that the wind is moving to.
mm,
And I think I think it's harder now in Western capitals to think you can just sit it out and eventually everyone will come to an agreement and we'll get back to what we had in 2015. I think that's becoming less and less. I mean, I don't think it was ever a realistic possibility, but I think it's becoming a thing that decision makers can less and less hope will come back. Um,
mm,
and so I think as far as there is a, I guess, a push to think about Myanmar, I think it's, I don't necessarily think they're, I don't necessarily think the conversations that guided policy of hopefully it just gets back to something that we can tolerate and are familiar with. But I
mm.
also don't think Myanmar's particularly thought about much at the moment, unfortunately.
But can it not be sort of packaged? Like, I know that this is such a hyper simplistic representation of the situation, but this is an argument that I've heard made because it's an easy argument to make. If we don't get involved in Myanmar, China will, right? It's a very simple dichotomous approach, and it ignores the subtle realities of international politics and economic interest. But ultimately, can this not be something to make people in policymaking positions aware that, look, this country is big. Like, it's physically bigger than Ukraine. It's 10 million people larger than Ukraine. It's also a lot closer than Ukraine, and China is eyeing it up. Would that not sort of get people to realize that this is not something we can just ignore?
I guess. I think the big problem is firstly that there's more pressing stuff in the eyes of policymakers. There is sort of the concern about the Western Pacific becoming a much more hot conflict zone. There is things that are taking up the limited time. But I think one of the other issues is Indian policy, which we haven't talked about yet. But I
Hmm.
think a lot of we mentioned sort of ASEAN before and sort of people being regionally, I guess, territorial to some extent. I think there's an idea of, oh, in that part of the world, India is sort of leading the front to contest Chinese influence. And Indian policy is, I would say, almost even maybe more, as much, if not more, than the Chinese policy is in bizarre support of the junta. So I think
Mm.
there's the idea that if this is if this is the tact that India is following, why should we rock the boat? I guess I don't know. I mean, I'm not clued in on the discussions. That's just an impression.
But I mean, so okay. So India's a bit of a wild card. India and China have been competing. Let's put it gently. They've been competing for some time now, and Indian aspirations are very clear. And it's something that you see, like, even if you spend enough time on the internet, you see a lot of the Indian voices sort of pushing very similar lines of rhetoric. So the idea that India will ascend and it will become a superpower, it will rival the United States and the European Union and the Chinese interests. This is something that we've been hearing for quite some time. So it's very clear that India wants to take a very proactive role in the region. And when it comes to Myanmar specifically, it it's kind of weird because they did accept quite a lot of refugees. There are a lot of refugees living in Mizoram in India at the moment, mostly from Chinland, and yet simultaneously, the relationship between the Indian military and the Myanmar military has remained quite strong. My understanding, I may be wrong, is that there has been a significant amount of cross-border terrorist activity, and that the two militaries have been cooperating for quite some time to try and clamp down on that. And for that reason, the Indians are very interested in maintaining a strong military regime within Myanmar to protect themselves from instability and therefore from terrorist organizations being able to slip across the border for sanctuary and then slip back into India to carry out attacks. Is that commensurate with what your understanding is of Indian policy?
Um, I don't know. I can't comment hugely on Indian policy because that's not where my expertise is.
Hmm.
But I would say, yeah, it absolutely is a hugely porous border. India can't stop insurgent groups from crossing the border. And yeah, there definitely has been historic ties between the militaries, especially along the border. I think there was a famous, I forget what year it was, but quite recently there was a famous raid into Myanmar by the Indian military that definitely was allowed by the Burmese military. But then there's also the idea that what's it called? That some of the militias that the Burmese military is supporting are the ones that are against the Indian state. So it's not a simple um, exercise in we support the Burmese military because they help us fight against people that fight against us. Um, but I'd say generally, And again, it sounds weird, but I don't necessarily know if it's a huge priority in New Delhi either. Even though it is right on their doorstep, even though the number of
Mm,
refugees is quite large, I think the even when you look at, and I don't want to get too into the weeds on Indian policy in the northeast, but I think even when you look at Manipur, one of the issues there has been sort of a central government disinterest in resolving the domestic crisis in Manipur, let alone sort of addressing their role across the border. But it's not an area that I'm an expert in, but I
mm.
think there is sort of this just we'll keep doing what we've always done, and that what we've always done has been dealing with the Burmese military, dealing with the Tatmadaw.
Mm. But then bringing that back to Australia, like it sounded to me, I may be wrong, but it sounded to me like what you were suggesting is that the Australian position is to sort of look at Myanmar and potentially other regions as well, and to say, well, we don't necessarily have to oppose Chinese interest because India will oppose Chinese interest for us. Um, is there a sense, and I don't know whether you can comment on this or not, but is there a sense in which Australian observers are kind of saying, well, if India gets involved in a situation, that's kind of a win by default for us?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to characterize it as an Australian position, more of an excuse for a lack of position.
Hmm.
Um, but
Okay.
yeah, I'm not sure. I think we have. I think it is just a contributing factor to our general apathy, if that
Okay.
makes sense.
So it's not so much that we're ideologically aligned with Indian foreign policy interests. It's more just, well, better India than China, and it's fine. It'll sort itself out, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think especially historically, maybe, and again, maybe in the last few months, developments on the ground will force that to change. But I think it's historically, oh, we'll look at it later. Let's just cross our fingers and hope it gets back to something that we're familiar with. And at worst, we dealt with, yeah. And I think it's I think it's tricky to put so much intent and thought behind the policy when the policy has sort of been non-existent.
Yeah. I mean that makes sense, but so it keeps coming back to this Australian policy position, which is apparently not to have a policy position on Myanmar. Is this potentially hamstringing Australia and Australia's hopes to be a mediating force, to be a positive influence within the broader Southeast Asian region? Because if you're not doing anything, you can't really move forward. You can't position yourself better to do things in the future. Is this a wasted opportunity for Australia?
I think it's a missed opportunity for sure. And I think beyond just Australia, it's a missed opportunity in the West and in sort of the parts of the world that generally care about human rights. I think there is a very easy victory to be had in more meaningful support for the democratic revolution in Myanmar that isn't forthcoming. So I don't necessarily think it's the lack of interest and policy is a huge cost, but I think it's definitely a missed opportunity in Australia and in Europe and in the US and at the UN.
Mm. And we discussed this in pre-interview, that my thinking on this matter is that simply nobody wants to be caught out down the line having advocated for an intervention, whether it's humanitarian, whether it's military, whether it's economic, an intervention that goes on longer than promised and costs more money than promised. And as we saw from the withdrawal from Afghanistan under Biden, you can not only face negative repercussions for instigating an operation, and then for prolonging that operation, which is why George Bush got in trouble for instigating going into Afghanistan. Obama got in trouble for extending the operation in Afghanistan, and then Joe Biden cops a lot of flack for pulling out of Afghanistan. You can't do right for doing wrong. so nobody really wants to get involved in something that's going to cost more money or cost lives or take longer than promised, and nobody wants to be seen associating with parties that a year from now, 5 years from now, might come under accusations of having committed war crimes, having behaved unethically, having been duplicitous, or who potentially do not turn out to be the great partners of peace um, that they're supposed to be. Selling missiles under the Reagan administration to Iran was perhaps not the best PR move they could have made in hindsight. So is that sort of dictating policy as far as you're seeing it, of everyone saying, well, I would just rather not be caught associated with something that might go sideways. And if I sit on my hands and do nothing, at least no one can say I made the wrong choice.
Yep, and I think that's the sort of tide that international, maybe not intervention, but international sort of policy has gone in the last 10 years. You mentioned Reagan sending missiles to Iran, but also sending missiles to the Mujahideen in, like, anti-air defense missiles to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I think that killed ever the possibility of helping, like, providing material to shoot down planes, not just in Myanmar, but in Syria and everywhere else in the world where that could be useful, even with the massive civilian protection that would come from it. I think broadly there's just no appetite for doing much. I think there's this, and I think not only is there a cost to doing actions, but there is a surprising cost in terms of attention and policy and thought to even learning about the situation, if that makes sense. I think there's an
Mm,
idea of, we don't know who the resistance is. I guess we know that there's the NLD. We guess we know there's the key leaders, but we don't know who is controlling violence on the ground. And we don't want to support. We don't want to provide material support to an actor that, yeah, like you mentioned, may turn out in the future to have done atrocities, or even just the idea of, well, Myanmar is historically been a place, it's the longest insurgency in the world by many metrics. It's always had violence. We don't want to just fuel the next round of violence after the junta's fallen and suddenly it's the ethnic groups against the NLD. I mean, not the NLD, the NUG.
yeah.
And I think reality, I think the NUG is doing a much better job than even the NLD of sort of
Mm,
bridging these ethnic gaps and sort of presenting a future of Myanmar that is amenable to not just the Burma heartland, but also all these traditionally more restive ethnic areas. And I think the NUG is doing a pretty I think it's difficult to fault what they're doing in building confidence with the EAOs and the EROs and everything. But I think there is just also a general idea of insurgency and violence is part of Myanmar. We don't want to provide things that will fuel the next round of that, even if it helps resolve this one. And I think that's one of the other sort of costs that policymakers are putting on it and are putting on action.
because the question then becomes, what is the worth of clean hands? Because we can pick a conflict, like, I don't care, like, you could throw a dart at a list of conflicts on the wall, um and I can show you, anyone can show you how all of the parties to that conflict did something wrong. um like, we can look at World War II, and we can say, well, the Nazis were committing horrific atrocities. Yeah, of course they were, absolutely they were. But the Red Army were not exactly polite. Even the Allied forces on the Western Front did engage in war crimes, nowhere near to the extent that the Germans did, but they did do it. And we all just sort of recognize that that's terrible, and we do what we can to try to prevent that. But we also recognize that it's not something to hide behind and say, well, if we get involved, you know, a village might get torched. Like, yeah, but that village is going to be torched if we don't get involved. We can do more good, and everyone seems to be preoccupied with this idea of, no, I cannot be associated with anything negative. It is better, it's the trolley experiment. It is better to not pull the switch and be associated with killing that one person than it is to let the other five people die. And what is the political value or and the long-term value to the health and the relevance of the nation if everyone's obsessed with having clean hands and never being involved in anything that might later turn out to be unpleasant in the media?
I think there's also the issue of people have learnt what conflict resolution looks like. People have learnt what peace building in the theoretic looks like. And straying from that is also something that they view as a cost. We have these ideas and these mechanisms of regional actors and dialogue coming together to come up with a peace agreement to stop the fighting, and anything outside of that framework is a risk and is a cost. And I think that's an issue as well. But I think, yeah, I guess it's tricky because, yeah, I think the reality is that, and I think this is something that the people on the ground in Burma have learned. You've seen how quickly it went from R2P to Save Us UN to Save Us US on the ground, all of which was unheeded. I think to some extent, and of course we should do all we can to sort of help build productive policy, but I also think on the ground, the Burmese people are proving that they can write their own future, and it's definitely pointing the right direction. And I think that's, I guess, one of the more positive outlooks to look on it, even with the international abandonment that we've seen. And of course, this isn't an excuse for that abandonment, but the even in spite of all these obstacles, the resistance is moving the needle the right way.
Absolutely, it is, and I think I agree with you, and I am in awe of the resistance movement and what they've managed to accomplish. I'm in awe of the National Unity Government and what they've managed to accomplish. I have many criticisms of the resistance. I have many criticisms of the PDF, of the EAOs, and of the NUG, but those do not overshadow the fact that this has never been done before, and this is happening under circumstances and on a scale that we haven't seen before. However, the flip side to the coin, though, is that it's not just like you're pointing out that the conflict is going in the right direction, and that's amazing. However, post-conflict, everyone needs to come together.
Yeah,
Everyone needs to agree on something. The economic revival of the nation is something that has to be dealt with. COVID-19 has not yet been fully dealt with because the vaccine programs were interrupted by the coup. That, like, people forget about that, because we're living here like triple vaccinated or quadruple vaccinated in Western countries. There are many people in Myanmar who have never seen a COVID-19 vaccine yet, and all of this is going to take a lot of effort. And there are already questions being raised about, hey, these EAOs and these PDF who have been manufacturing weapons, acquiring weapons, stealing weapons, they now have weapons. Is there going to be a buyback scheme? Is there going to be a voluntary disarmament? Is the nation potentially going to disintegrate? And looking not just at the conflict, but the post-conflict, are you as optimistic about the post-conflict prognosis if international abandonment continues? Or do you think that as soon as the conflict begins to wind down, countries are going to be more willing to get involved?
it's a good question. And I think one other aspect of the international response that we haven't touched on so far, but you talked about it, I guess, in the vaccine delivery, is how much international aid provision has been stubborn against coordinating with resistance forces, and has been in many ways tied to the reach of the junta government, which is shrinking and shrinking, and therefore the ability of international aid provision is shrinking and shrinking, and there's becoming this situation where the needs are growing, and even if there was adequate funding, the inadequacies of the UN response and the international aid provision response denies that from getting to where it's needed. That's a whole other aspect that I just wanted to bring up.
Mm.
in as far as the post-conflict goes, I don't know. A lot of it depends on the policy of the EROs, the EAOs, and the NUG. There are some red flags I see. For example, looking at sort of some of the TNLA's statements towards the KIA in northern Shan State and how they're sort of stepping on toes. How's that going to resolve? I'm personally, I've been skeptical in the past, and the NUG has managed issues in a way that I think has been productive and helpful. And I guess I see no reason that once victory is closer, that's going to massively change. Um, and I think the international community, once the hard work is done, won't necessarily have a problem stepping in and helping out as much as they have had a problem with that before. But yeah, a lot of that's still in the air, and I think there definitely is the opportunity for governments and policymakers and analysts and think tanks to sort of make sure that they're using influence however they can to sort of help move towards a future that resolves a lot of these issues.
So to take this down to brass tacks, because we do number, among some of our listeners, certain people who are in policymaking positions. Um, if you were to talk directly to a policymaker, what would you say can be gained by whether Australia or other Western powers? What can be gained, very pragmatically speaking, in getting involved in Myanmar proactively?
I think, I mean, it's a bit ideological, but I think the idea that you can turn a country that has historically been a violent dictatorship into really what could arguably, with the right timeline, become a pretty flourishing, progressive, great democracy. I think that's an opportunity. But I think speaking to a policymaker one on one, speaking to a diplomat, speaking to whoever would listen, the one thing I would say is that the status quo is dead. There's not going to be a movement where there's a slow democratization of the country where the military sort of enables the government the country to become more democratic. That it's the idea that we can wait and hope for the best, and hope, not just hope for the best, but hope for something familiar, isn't going to happen. It's a matter of the military winning or the military losing, and not not putting your foot on either side is sort of as bad as putting your is not as bad, but is definitely a hindrance rather than a help.
Okay, I think that's a very important perspective. I think that's a very useful way to put it, and I think ideology is something that we kind of don't want to focus on as much, but we should. If we do genuinely believe in the ideas of spreading democracy and spreading stability and spreading, all of the advantages that come with emerging from dictatorship and emerging from conflict, then we need to, I think, play a very proactive role in making sure that those benefits can reach the people who are standing there, arms open, asking for democracy, asking for development, asking to open their nations and their borders and broaden their horizons. And I just think it's horribly ironic that we can live in a situation where we in the West have been on the high horse ever since World War II, talking about how we need to change the world and turn a new leaf and democracy and peace and stability and all that sort of stuff. And then you look at Myanmar when the people are in the streets demanding it, asking for it, saying, we want this, please come get involved in our country and help us achieve this. Everyone just sort of turns their back and starts whistling nonchalantly. Um, it leaves a bitter taste in the mouth, is what I
Yeah,
would say.
and
Yeah.
even along with that, having done so much work on human rights in Xinjiang, it's bitter taste in the mouth where we say, well, we should care about human rights in Xinjiang when we
Hmm.
struggle to care about human rights in other places. And there definitely is that aspect of politicized ulterior motive, which is a hard accusation to sort of dismiss when we have such a lackluster response to abuses in other places. In in terms of what to say to policymakers, and I know you've had Sean Turnell on this podcast recently, who I'm sure has said it to Australian policymakers in a much more educated and a much more knowledgeable sense than I can. But in that pragmatic sense, there's also the fact that if you want a prosperous country in Southeast Asia with huge economic and human potential, the military are not the people, are not the caretakers that can bring that potential out of the country, either in its economic or its people to people sense.
Absolutely. So I think we've covered a lot of ground in the last approximately 2 hours of discussion, and I really want to thank you for setting aside the time to discuss that.
It's hard for me to think of because I know the people that listen to this podcast are pretty informed about Myanmar compared to the general public or even the policymakers. But I guess one thing I would say that I would want to stick in your mind is that in the last few months, and keep in mind this is the dry season that we're talking about, in the last few months we've seen a massive change in the tone of conflict in Myanmar. We've seen it change from this really dynamic shifting control on the ground to the resistance across the country being able to actually control and defend areas against a consistent military counterattack. And this is in the dry season when the Myanmar military is at its most capable and its most mobile and its most effective. I think what I would say is that on the ground, what we've seen in the last few months is not just the capture of junta positions, but also the establishment of resistance outposts across the country in Sagaing, in Karen, in Karenni, and in Shan State. The actual change from this being a resistance that stands in place but then moves aside when the military comes by to one that can actually stand their own, defend, and effectively attack military positions. And I think this is a shift that I've noticed in the last few months. And of course, it's not uniform across the country. Places in the far south are still struggling and are still sort of further back in that timeline. But I guess from my perspective, thousands of kilometers in the sky on a satellite looking down, you can see the change in tone of this conflict. And I think a lot of people, observers on the ground, are also acknowledging this change of tone. And I think it is pushing towards a Myanmar that is, I guess, pushing towards resistance gains and resistance victories that even months ago I didn't really think were likely. And so I guess that's just my perspective of how everything's changing recently and how people should think about it moving forward.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. As regular listeners are aware, we often remind our audience about our nonprofit mission, Better Burma, at the end of a show. Truth be told, fundraising is hard work, and I can personally attest to the fact that it's really no fun to keep asking for contributions. Yet, the situation on the ground now in Myanmar is so distressing that we continue to do so on behalf of the Burmese people. What is most helpful at this time are recurring donations, which help alleviate both the stress and time involved in fundraising. If you are able to pledge a certain amount per month, our team can plan around having at least a consistent minimum amount to work within each month. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam